Amen. My study this morning, it's from a Vespers presentation, and it was Atheism and the New Crusade. It was number 10 in that recorded series. So the question we were asking, why was Elder Tess trying to warn us about atheism? Because we had spent from 2018 targeting religion, specifically Protestantism. We were seeing Protestantism and Dominionism, how they had impacted the Republican Party, especially the likes of Ted Cruz. But when we started to examine things more closely, we were seeing this was not the whole problem. Remember, she begins by making the point that the midnight cry was to move us from being right wing to left wing. Because whenever we are dealing with the great controversy or the political spectrum, it centres on a choice between Christ and Satan, or left wing and right wing. And that's not to say everything on the left wing's right either. As we know, there are many atheists on the right wing and there are many Protestants on the left wing. So what is the real core beating heart of the left wing? What that differentiates it from the right wing? When we considered that, we saw the difference was how they approached freedom and equality. So we had to make a choice. And we know Adam and Eve had to make a choice. Their choice was whether to eat of the tree or not. And remember, Elder Tess likened this to an election campaign. God was saying, don't eat it, choose my way of government. Choose my principles. So Satan comes down and says to Eve, look what my government can offer you. Unrestrained freedom, where God is trying to restrain you. He is trying to stop you from reaching your full potential. So vote for me. So we know Eve votes for Lucifer. It was a campaign that Satan won. He claims this earth because they voted for a fallen angel. And everything that has happened since is because they voted for a political system that Satan offered in Eden. And what God has been doing since then is a political campaign to bring us back to his form of government. Because every single person in their lifetime gets to vote whether they want Lucifer's government, unrestrained freedom, or God's government where there are checks and balances. But both sides of the great controversy are centred on politics. So therefore we need to understand them. The midnight cry was part of God's political campaign for humanity to move us. Because externally, politically, is directly connected to the campaign between Christ and Satan. As we said before, Protestantism is not the whole problem. And as a movement, we were not seeing this. So what Elder Tess did, she took us to an interview Sarah Henry did with Alex DeBranco. And the website is The Humanist. And the title is Exposing and Challenging Male Supremism. This is, it's an atheist publication. So Sarah Henry is an atheist, and she's interviewing Alex DeBranco, who is also an atheist. She begins the interview by asking Alex DeBranco to tell me a little bit about yourself. That camera looks like I'm looking down all the time. I don't know. So this is quoting Alex DeBranco. Might be better. While my original research focused on the Christian right and anti-abortion movements, I also worked as an activist on sexual violence issues. And starting in the early 2010s, I was watching men's rights activists like Paul Elam and their victim-blaming rhetoric. Over time, I became more concerned with the growth of secular misogynist movements. And by the time Donald Trump was elected president, I had been pushing for some years for social justice organisations to expand their focus on reproductive justice to a more inclusive gender justice framework that would theorise rape culture as right-wing ideology. The misogyny demonstrated by Trump's campaign brought new interest to this subject, and I was able to start writing and speaking in key venues about the threat posed by male supremism. Unfortunately, the subject continued to be understudied and treated as a secondary concern or gateway to ideologies taken more seriously, like white supremism, rather than being recognised as a threat by itself. So her original research focused on Christian right and anti-abortion movements in the early 2010s. She worked as an activist on sexual violence issues. She was watching men's rights activists like Paul Elam and their victim-blaming rhetoric. Then she was asked, why is the mission of the IRMS, and that stands for the Institute for Research on Male Supremism, so important at this moment in time? What makes it so relevant? Again, this is quoting Alex DeBranco. In 2018, there were 2 mass killings by men connected to the incel ideology in North America. Incels being men who call themselves involuntary celibate and consider it an injustice that attractive women don't have sexual intercourse with them. These events really change the amount of attention focused on these growing online communities. However, there continues to be a problem with sympathetic myths associated with how misogynist mobilisations are viewed, including buying into MRA or incel talking points. For instance, reporting that male violence is driven by rejection from women, rather than understanding it as a part of a male supremacist, anti-feminist ideology that should be approached in the same way that we would approach white supremacist and anti-Semitic ideologies and violence. There was even an appalling New York column by Ross Douthat, excuse me, in which he suggested that if we talk about economic redistribution, then why not sexual redistribution? As though women's bodies are just currency. IRMS is dedicated to changing the narratives that give shelter to male supremacist and misogynist ideologies and mobilisations, and to supporting media, researchers and activists in challenging these threats. There are at least 2 attacks related to incel ideology that were thwarted in the last year because they were stopped without fatalities. These attempts received only minor attention, and new data shows incel online communities are growing and becoming more extreme. In other words, the threat these mobilisations pose still remains and is growing, which is why the mission of the IRMS is so important. Then Sarah Henry, that's the one that's interviewing her, replies, "It seems to me that more often than not, religious dominionism, white nationalism, and male supremacy are inextricably intertwined. Is that something that you found in your work? What prompted you to specifically focus on male supremacy in your new venture?" So the interviewer is noting that most of the time it seems religious dominionism is intertwined with white nationalism, which is racism, and male supremacy, which is sexism. But she asks what specifically prompted her to focus on male supremacy. So Alex DeBranco replies, "I would actually have to say that contemporary white supremacist and male supremacist communities demonstrate more of what I term secular misogyny," and which she included that appears to be an over-representation of atheists. So she is saying there is an over-representation of atheists. These men, they came from conservative Christian backgrounds. What they do, they disregard their belief in God, but they bring baggage that stems from conservative Christian patriarchy. So what Elder Tess was trying to get us to see in these studies was both racism as a prophetic subject and as sexism as a prophetic subject, as the Sunday law issue. We have to see it in its correct external context. And when we put it in its correct external context, It's a combination of atheism and I'll say weaponized libertarianism and misogyny represented by men's rights movements. So what the Sunday law history is going to be driven by is culture. It's going to be driven by politics. Remember, she said we spent most of the time targeting religion, and especially Protestantism. And what she wants us to see is not the churches, but culture. You might say we learned so much about the evangelical churches and the moral majority. So they have a part to play in this. For example, if you look at the issue of abortion in America, it is the churches, but it is also culture. So to reconcile this, you could say they are two sides of the same coin. So going back to the story of the 10 years leading up to 1989, you have the moral majority in this history. What was the purpose of having those 10 years before the time of the end? This isn't even in the time of our probation. I think how we framed this in the past, if you were to take the USSR and America and their proxy war in Afghanistan, for example, Adventism was meant to recognise and to see the time of the end is coming, was to let them know there is a big event coming. If they had have recognised this, they would have seen the King of the North and the King of the South battle. They would have recognised the time of the end waymark. But with regards to the moral majority, we have a whole decade of evangelicals seducing the Republican Party to align with their moral and social agenda. Because Jerry Falwell recognised that he needed a platform to espouse his beliefs. He had to imbibe his ideology somewhere, so he finds the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan. He was using politics to spread his ideology. That is the reason why Elder Tess had a lot to say about the fall of the Republican Party at the various waymarks. If you compare and contrast how God works and how Satan works, God first takes a message to the church and then to the world. And the reason why God takes a message to the church is because God needs to pull out a group from the church, the stone cut out of the mountain. And then that message will go to the world and say, come and join this movement. So how will Satan work? He's going to work in the same way. Satan is going to appeal to someone because Satan needs someone also to take a message to the world. A rhetorical question. If in our history, under the history of a culture war, if the evangelical churches do the work for Satan, who will listen? Because there have been many polls done by different research agencies that point to the decline in religious affiliation, specifically in America. So this first one is from the Pew Research Centre, and it's in the 1990s, and that's not that long ago, 90% of American adults identified as Christian. By 2023, this drops to 68%. They describe this as a rapid decline. This next one, it's from the Barna Group, and they look at this from a different perspective. It was not just saying if you were a Christian, but rather a practicing Christian. In the year 2000, 45% of Americans qualified as practicing Christians. But by 2019, that had dropped to 25%. In essence, the share of practicing Christians had nearly dropped in half since the year 2000. So if you looked at these statistics and you compare where America is today as a society to the 1800s, or 1888 when the Sunday Law would have been in that history, religion is not a priority for Americans in the same way that it was. So if Satan wants to take a message, a mark of the beast message, is Satan going to use evangelical churches to do that? No, because the majority of people will not take them seriously. This last one was a Gallup poll. In the 2 decades since the turn of the millennium, religious affiliation has gone from around 70%, where it had stood more or less since the 1930s, to a mere 47%. Speaking on this in the Weekly Dish article, the author makes the point. But what we're witnessing, it seems to me, is not a collapse in the religious impulse as such, but the need to transcend, to find meaning and purpose, for that is eternal for humans. So what we are witnessing is when politics replaces or becomes a form of religion. The fusion of evangelical Christianity with the Republican Party blasphemously climaxed in the Trump cult. And among the Trump cult, among the Trump banners and the Confederate flags, is the crowds that invaded the Capitol on January 6, was a flurry of wooden crosses. So what these polls tell us and show us, there is a dramatic decline in religion. And the point from all this is that politics is the religion of culture wars. And in a history of culture wars, politics has placed religion. In the 1800s, you had religion which is going to use churches to spread the message. These churches are going to have different branches and argue over different doctrines. In a culture war, you're going to have politics in the 21st century. And these politics are going to have political parties to spread the message of different ideologies. This is just a reference from a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. The author was Jonathan Haidt. And one of the points the author makes is that religion and politics serves similar functions in humans. They bind groups together through their shared moral beliefs, and it creates a sense of belonging. So again, two sides of the same coin. In the 21st century, where the issues are cultural, it is political parties that are going to do the messaging. The churches are not the main problem. Also, the correct external context is represented by atheism, libertarianism, and men's rights activists. And as an example, Elder Tess, she took us to a Vox article. And remember, she looked at a person called Max. Max was about 27 years old. So again, we're talking about a younger segment of society. And the discussion was in the shadow of Gamergate. And the reason we are looking at this secular trinity is that it is more symbolic of America's future than its past. It's not just aging Protestants who are losing their dominionism. It's about the likes of Max losing their culture. So this is paraphrasing Max. He doesn't think much of feminism in general, or what feminism has become. Once the voting and the jobs and the abortion rights were sorted out, he thinks feminism is a dog whistle for self-pity and sexism towards men. So Max sees that women have the right to vote, they can get a job, they have abortion rights, which I think was a bit premature in the context of 2022 when Roe versus Wade was overturned. But men like Max, they are less radical. They are fine for women to have freedom. But what they are not okay with is equality. And that's the issue. It's not about freedom, it's about equality. And the reason they don't want equality is because it's going to cost them something. Again, using Max's words, that is sexism towards men. Men are feeling that they are the ones being discriminated against. So they point the finger back at women. And a libertarian would say, this is impacting our freedom. Why are they like this? They are like this because of fear. And it's a deep fear that if they relinquish their hold they have on women, then they might become the oppressed. It is the same fear behind white supremacy, behind losing a majority white America, that white people will suddenly be suppressed by a multicultural country. In 1888 history, They were driven by fear. They were oppressed. So that is why in that history they oppressed Irish Catholics, Jews and Seventh-day Adventists and secular humanists or free thinkers, because it was a dominant Protestant church. But it's ironic that the people who are now being oppressed are the ones who feel they are the victims. Who are not being oppressed are the ones who feel they are the victims. Max would prefer not to be called a men's rights activist. He prefers the term humanist, which is another way of saying a rational atheist. Because for Max, it was a crusade, a struggle against firstly the church, this is atheism, but also the state, which is libertarianism, and of course women's feminism, because they claim they are the last purveyors of reason. This is a quote from Paul Elam. We mentioned his name before. Paul Elam is the founder of an international conference for men's issues and formerly a publisher of A Voice for Men, which is the publication that is to be the online flagship of men's rights movements. And this is a quote from that publication. I have often wondered if my state of mind as an atheist has also played a role in becoming a men's rights activist. I like to think I view things objectively, that I rely on available science rather than faith or folklore to shape my beliefs. That attitude has certainly helped me to understand issues like domestic violence and alleged wage gaps as much as it has evolution. So what Paul Elam is saying is that his state of mind as an atheist played a direct role in him becoming a men's rights activist. In other words, his fight against feminism as an atheist, he is able to look at things objectively. He doesn't need faith like religious people, and that he can understand domestic violence as much as evolution.
Can I just say something
Yeah.
here? This is so rich. This is such a rich overview in so many different areas. Even just that part there, it ties back to men and women have inherent rights. As an evolutionist, as an atheist, okay. But yeah, I've got other things to say, but maybe I'll touch it later.
Okay.
So keep going, sorry.
So where have they got their thinking from? Where they expressed left-wing ideology like gay marriage or abortion rights. They're okay with those things. So I want you to remember the four horsemen: Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. These were the four horsemen of modern atheism. They might espouse left-wing ideology, but if you put them on the spot, then they are right-wing. It is like Trump saying he's not a white supremacist. He dog whistles, and you see white supremacists follow him. Dawkins says he's a feminist. Then he will say date rape is not as bad as stranger rape at knife point. He doubles down on that, suggesting being raped by a stranger with a weapon is more harmful than being raped by someone you might have known or had an element of trust in. This is the feminism that Dawkins expresses. He talks about intrinsic nature. He will refer to intrinsic strengths and weaknesses. This is how men and women are wired. He will say that men are aggressively sexually excited by women. Women, they have the sexual appeal and manipulation. It is like it is a woman's fault if she is raped. He will say that if women don't want to be in a courtroom testifying against men that rape them, they should never get drunk. Because if you put a drunk woman with a man who has aggression, what do you expect to happen?
Is this the counterfeit fast brain?
It's probably above my... Anyone else?
Well, they're treating it like it's a fast brain response. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, you just react to it.
So, sorry, that's just how we're wired.
That's the next.
Oh, okay.
This is what social Darwinism teaches, that these intrinsic attributes in men and women have developed through evolution over millions of years. This is why Hitchens says women have developed an intrinsic ability to be cunning minxes. They are able to manipulate men, so they are the dominant force even in a patriarchal society. Social Darwinism has played out as a justifiable assault on women by aggressive men. It is the woman's fault if she causes him to rape her. And this is the thinking that filters all the way down to Max. So the idea sexual harassment is just what men do is the 21st century atheist interpretation of boys will be boys. You can see the same logic in statements that justify sexual violence on a woman's behaviour on how she dresses. So how would these people, atheists, who are not just misogynistic, but often racist, how would they approach church and state? You could ask the same about libertarianism. How would libertarians support a union of church and state? They would not. Because the Sunday law is not about church and state. That doesn't mean the churches won't have a part to play. But this, as I said earlier, and Elder Tess was trying to tell us, Protestantism is not the whole of the problem. And it isn't the cause of the problem in relation to sexism or the Sunday law. If it was, as America becomes more secular, this problem, sexism, should be decreasing. For these men, misogyny is not based in religion, but in biology. Whereas religion is based upon misogyny, and misogyny is where they can come into agreement. And it was this younger age group, like Max, that overwhelmingly supported Trump and helped get him elected, because basically they have the same culture. And as we also said earlier, it is politics, and that is what is replacing religion. That is what we are seeing today, because politics becomes a form of religion. It is because politics serves a similar function in human beings. It binds people together in their shared moral beliefs, and it creates a sense of belonging because they have shared values. So in the 21st century, where the issues are cultural, it's about political parties. They are going to do the messaging. So that's why Elder Tess shifted our focus from religion to culture. Elder Terry has now defined culture as nationalism. Remember, a nationalist is proud of his country no matter what it does, which is just pure arrogance, and that leads to war. I would define that as unilateralism. Whereas a patriot is proud of his country for what it does, which is a feeling of responsibility. I would define that as more multilateral. So now our understanding of church and state is MAGA, which is the culture, nationalism, the ideology, that the church, that's the church, and the vessel MAGA rides is Trumpism, the new Republican Party. That would be the state, and together they make up the seventh kingdom. So at the Republican National Convention in July 2024, we saw this in full view. The image was set up, and we recognised that as the National Sunday Law. But now, if you listen to J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 2025, he is pushing the ideology of MAGA and their idea of democracy on the world. So we are now heading to the worldwide Sunday Law. This is just a reminder of testimonies to finish up of Volume 9, page 11, paragraph 2. The agencies of evil are combining. I would say they have combined. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. But then she says the final moves will be rapid ones. I think we are living in that very time of the fulfillment of that prophecy. That's my study. We'll just close in prayer. Our loving God in heaven, we thank you that we can look back on these studies and how you have led this movement in our past history. We thank you for those studies that Elder Tess gave us, that showed us what the Sunday Law is going to be more about. We thank you, and may we realise that we are living in the time where these prophecies are being fulfilled. And you have said the final moves will be rapid ones. I pray for each member of this movement that we would be ready for those things that are happening nearly on a daily basis. Help each one to remain focused and to keep up with the light that has been given to us. We thank you again for your love and care for your people. We just pray that you would be with us for the remainder of the Sabbath, that you would be with Yam Bucky as she has the next study. I thank you, and we ask all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Questions and comments for John?
I'm happy to start. I thought, as John was reviewing, I just thought this was so rich with so many different things. And just even one little component that we're just witnessing in front of our eyes. You've mentioned, you know, there's a deep-seated fear in that side that I think that it's, if they relinquish the hold they have on women, I think it says then they might become the oppressed. And so, you know, it's almost like a victim mentality. And it's the same fear behind white supremacy, behind losing a majority of white America, that white people will suddenly be suppressed by a multicultural country. And it's just the most fascinating thing to see the South African president there and Trump explaining how there's white genocide against white South African farmers. And they're the only immigrants that are being brought into America. It is the most blatant, but you can see that the mindset behind it is everything you've just talked about.
And Rubio's had to go appear before the Senate, and Rubio answer to that was because those Afrikaners think as they do, you know, they're on the same page.
Yeah. Oh, anyway, I'll hand it over to someone else if someone else wants to. I'll keep going. I think what you've just explained, that summary just gives us an overview of the Sunday law movement. And that it makes you think, well, you know, because we look at Trump, and I've been thinking about this more and more recently, and I reflect on all the rallies that he did. And now I'm possibly starting to see that more as I'll call it a religious culture. He's like the pastor standing out the front of the culture, and that's their church service for their culture, and he's their hope, and he's just spewing out.
Well, that's what I mean. Religionists or atheists can,
So I think
he's brought them all into line.
So I think he's both. I think he's both. I think church and state have come together again in one person. That's what I'm saying. It's not like, it's like the, you know.
I think
it's Babylon, it's Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
I'm not sure whether we can see a pope, you know, as separate to the kings. I think he's embodied. I think he's the pastor as well. He's the cultural pastor as well as the king.
So it's just like ancient Babylon.
It's the Medes and Persians. It's the two.
And this is spiritual Babylon now. So it's showing the end from the beginning.
And this, going through this is the church side of things. And all I'm seeing
is politics.
I'm seeing Trump as the pastor of that.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the state side. As you went through this, it just made it clear to me that he's the lead cultural priest, if you want to call it.
Yep.
Does anyone disagree with that, or I don't know.
See, I think I can. I was just going to say I agree with all of that. I think it's interesting that human nature, or what we see, I think largely expresses in human nature, is when anyone has something, even if it's an advantage or it's a privilege or whatever, they don't want to give it up for the sake of somebody else. So, which is basically selfishness, which is really what Satan's whole regime runs on, is pure selfishness. Because when you want ultimate freedom for yourself, regard at any cost to anyone else, then that's just ultimate selfishness. And it's just an interesting thing that obviously male supremacists don't want to give up anything because they don't want to become subject, or they don't want to become the same as the women have been, basically. And then they want to but at the same time, they wouldn't even have to be the same as the women have been in order for them to see themselves like that's what they are, because they already see themselves as victims if they have to give up a little bit. So it's just, I don't know, it's just the extremity of selfishness and self-absorb. It's a horrible, horrible culture.
It's the opposite to the golden rule.
Yes, 100%, exactly, 100%.
The way that Lynn and Brendan have both talked about it, that they don't want to give up what they've got. It really stuck out to me that, you know, if they don't want to become like women are, you can't have that position without acknowledging, however subconsciously, that you are oppressing somebody else. So I find it really interesting that you can do that, but still sort of see yourself as a victim preemptively and operate from that sort of victimhood mindset, even though you subconsciously, on some level at least, acknowledging that you're oppressing somebody else.
Which is fear, which what John talked about. That it's the fear of that inevitability. I see what you're saying.
That is interesting, isn't it? I mean, and I think it's funny, not funny, haha, really, but peculiarly funny that they are able to, without even maybe being fully conscious of the fact, just by the fact that they're doing that, we don't want to be like that. They're admitting that like that exists or has existed. So, like you say, that's just by their protesting, they're acknowledging what has happened. But they're not focused on that, obviously, but it is an interesting observation.
Just add my little bit there, Lynn, too. It's Marie here. So just like we all, as the white race, have a privileged position over many darker races, so men in general have a privileged position over women and children. And so they don't want to lose that privileged position. And the fact that there might be a hint of that gives them reason to think that they're being oppressed. Same as what you're saying.
Yeah,
really.
no, that's true. It's good to hear different perspectives of how to say it, even if it's similar or the same, but I think the point you brought up there about being white and Indigenous and all of that, I mean, that's something that most of us, our privilege that we don't always be aware of. And that's part of, we saw that very clearly when they were doing the referendum. I don't remember what it was called now, but you know what I mean. But yeah, no, I agree with you there.
And I think when we are in a privileged position, and I've been in the same boat as this, you don't even know that you're in a privileged position. If it wasn't for this movement, I wouldn't know that as a white person, I'm actually in a privileged position. It's not until you become you gain knowledge on that and you realize, you see it in different eyes. But that is a privilege, and I think that, well, when I say it is a privilege, I'm sorry, I don't mean that in an offensive way. I mean that, most people complain. They say, oh, it's racism back the other way against white people. In actual fact, it's not. It's just that people are so used to having that privileged position that they don't see it as it is. And I think that's the way it is for a lot of men too.
That's exactly what I was trying to point out. Whatever the privilege is that people have, even, it's like when governments bring in some sort of extra tax to cover something, but they're going to get rid of it when something else goes. For example, a toll road. Oh, yes, well, this will only be here till we've paid off the toll road. But you notice when the toll road's paid off, the tolls usually stay there. There's no change because they're used to having that. And it's the same with privilege. People are so used to having it, they don't recognize it. And then when they feel
Challenged.
threatened, or challenged, then they start to protest about that because they don't feel like they're, in any way, they look at equality as all being the same, like, oh, well, if they've all got the opportunity to, like they say, women can work, women can get a job, whatever. Like, it's just I think it's almost a difference between equality and equity, and having an understanding of what that really means.
Good point.
Just continuing on from what Marie said, with men having a privileged position over women, and I guess John's underlying point, or one of the primary points that he pulled out, was, well, that's because from an atheist point of view, that's just the natural order of things. So you can't change that. And so it's almost like society is now in a position moving forward it's impossible for that model to change, because if it's baked in to our biology, or that's how they think their fast brain works, you don't have a choice. So men have an intrinsic strength in areas, and women have intrinsic weaknesses in those same areas. So just by sheer biology, the model says that men will be supreme, and it's impossible to move from that. And that's what underlines the Sunday law movement. It's baked in, you can't change it. And that's scary. I guess that's why it's the seventh kingdom and it's done. There's nothing, what can you be redeemed when that's the model?
I was just thinking about Adventism, self-support ministries in Adventism. I was just thinking things have moved from, paganism to Protestantism, and now religion to politics, culture to nationalism, and they have no awareness of the progression of events towards the very final movements. And to me, it is quite sad to think that, I think about people that I've associated with in the past, and they just have no inkling at all as to what is going on. Yeah. I don't want to leave it at a negative point, so I will, as a movement, we are very privileged to be to be aware of what's going on, to walk through the events, to see what's happening. truly privileged. Thank you, John, for the summarization. It's awesome.
Has anyone given thought to that model possibly being the Sunday Law Movement's version of the fast brain? Sorry, we can't. I'll give you an example. I couldn't help it. She was dressed that way. It's not my choice. It was my fast brain that forced me to attack her or to say that or to act in that way towards her.
And I just say, I think that's a really good observation. I don't know that they would blame their fast brain. I think they'd blame the woman, because you always blame someone else. Usually, if your fast brain is so,
But their fast brain is saying, well, their version of fast brain.
Yes.
So
Yeah, no, 100% agree with what you're saying. 100% agree. I'm just adding the fact that oftentimes our fast brain reactions as human beings, we tend to blame someone else for them anyway, because we don't. I mean, it's only really since we've come to understand those things a bit better that we've seen them in a slightly different, perspective, or a different, big, not slightly, considerably different perspective. But no, that's a really good observation. That was mainly what I was saying, because I think it has to be part of it, doesn't it? Because that's human nature. So it's inevitable that that's going to be a huge part of that problem, I would say. Fast brain is sort of like there is a lot of fast brain behavior going on.
Think about the consequence of that, though. The consequence, if that is the model, the consequence of that is it is not a man's choice because of their biological makeup. It is not a choice to abuse women. It is inherently baked in. And so play that out over the next how many years? They're innocent. Innocent because of their own biology.
With that, Brendan, I'd like to add, what about a grown man and a child? Look at that scenario and try to put that same perspectives overlaid onto that.
Sorry, Josephine, can you repeat that? What do you mean by that? Just so I understand.
I mean, you look at the woman and you say, well, it's a man's nature, but you look at the woman and you say, oh, she's tempting me. What about an innocent child that wears like a big outsized dress, and what kind of temptation is that? Is that equal to a woman? I think it's just they're just trying to get out of the platform that they put themselves into, because that's not the whole picture. That's not the big picture.
It's also very culturally indoctrinated, at least from my life experience, that men are different from women. They're more focused on sexual things, and so they can't help that. That's just how they are. Like, that's something that's been around since Adam was a boy. I mean, it just is something I've heard most of my adult life, at least. And I'm sure it's not new to anybody else. And I think it's quite common for men to feel, well, they can't help that. That's just how they are. And that's, you know, not an unusual thing. But even in your example, I get the point you're making, I think, Josephine, because it's obviously a bit ridiculous to think that a child is going to be responsible. But in one sense, those people feel that that's how they are. That's how they were born. And therefore, they can't help it. It's a preference. And they even talk themselves into thinking that it's actually good for children. So people do anything to justify anything in their mind, I guess.
Yeah, it's cultural indoctrination. I'm agreeing with you. They just refuse to see the full picture.
Because it's self-incriminating. Sorry to interrupt. It goes back to what I was saying originally. People don't want to lose anything. They don't want to be at fault. They don't want to take responsibility, because that's kind of the bad side of human nature, to blame somebody else for anything and everything. Sorry, go ahead. I think it was Brendan trying to speak. Sorry.
I mean, I guess sounds silly. We're right up one end of the spectrum here. What we're talking about here, we're talking about men saying they don't have a choice. Oh, it's not my fault. Look, she was drunk and look how she's dressed. So we're at one end of the spectrum, but this is all originates on the other end of the spectrum, which is basically the same mindset. Well, like your men are from Mars, women are from Venus type of women and men, they just think a bit differently. And it can be so subtle, but that's just it's the same. It's the same line. It's just at one extreme to the other. It's still the same mindset. It's still the same intrinsic strengths and weaknesses. So even though it might sound silly, you might think it's silly up one end of the extreme. And, we'll look at, but then who's to say some of us sitting here right now aren't actually agreeing with some of the subtle versions of what that says? So really, we've got to be careful. We're not actually on the same thinking similarly, where it can be so subtle. Like, yes, of course men think a bit differently in those ways and women in those ways, but on subtle things, not abuse. I mean, at the moment we're focusing all the way at the other end. Bring it back up the other end and then see where we're at.
God didn't create us with a different brain.
I have a question. That's for John. At the end of your presentation, you spoke about culture being state nationalism. I was wondering if you could help me link that to the topic that you discussed for the presentation, which was more about sexism. Given that you mentioned both in the one presentation, and both are about culture, but both seem to be slightly different aspects of culture, are you able to connect them together in some sort of logic? Like, I could suggest a few maybe, but I'd rather just get your thoughts.
What's the question?
Ask it repeated.
You want me to ask it again? Or am I not loud enough?
Sure what your question is.
Okay, can you hear the volume okay? Is it? You can hear
The volume is just
okay.
clarity.
So it's just what the question is.
I apologise.
No, that's okay. And if anybody else can listen carefully and then maybe you have a go at rephrasing my question for John, sometimes another person might be able to do that. All right, so I noticed at the end of your presentation that you said Elder Terry has helped us to see that culture, the issue we're looking at is state nationalism when it comes to culture. So you connected culture to state nationalism. But earlier in the presentation, because you were reviewing Vespers, I think when we were talking about culture, we were looking at gender inequality, so sexism, when we were talking about culture. So you spoke about culture and you've mentioned two different aspects or issues that we're looking at in culture. And I wondered if you were able to show us or help me to understand, maybe, is there a connection between the sexism part and the state nationalism part? If that still doesn't make sense, maybe someone else can have a go, or maybe my question doesn't make sense.
No, you're trying to, whether you can connect culture to nationalism. I mean,
No, I want to connect the sexism to the nationalism.
because I think that gets back to culture, because
Okay, so maybe your answer is that culture is the connecting link between the sexism and the nationalism.
I mean, culture deals with sexism, racism, and so does nationalism, you know. I mean, that's kind of how I would understand it. I mean, if
Yeah,
someone
okay,
Don't
can
they both
explain it,
connect?
if someone can explain it better, go ahead.
Do they both connect to patriarchy? That's what I would assume, that they're both connected to patriarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate on that a bit, Marie?
Well, I guess that's where the culture comes in too, because in my way of thinking, everything seems to revolve around patriarchy. So nationalism is very much about being the biggest and the best and the strongest and the most powerful at all cost. And so is sexism. And in my way of thinking, patriarchy is sort of at the top of that pyramid, so to speak.
So
Does
what
that
they
make
have in
sense?
common, I think so, and I think what you're saying, if I'm right, if I'm understanding you, is that both revolve around, some people are more equal than others. That's the
Yeah.
underlying theme for both of them, which is basically the definition of inequality. The nationalism has got to do with the national identity. Some are better than others, and then the other one is the gender one. So yeah, I think that's helpful. I guess what I'm looking at is, it's the sin of the United States. So from one point of view, they've obviously got everyone in the world, not just America, has an issue with, and in fact, you could probably extend the nationalism issue across the world as well. But I guess if we're focusing on the United States, we're seeing sexism played out, but we're also seeing nationalism. And both of them, what they have in common is, like you said, Marie, patriarchy, which is like a symbol for a hierarchy of equality. Like some people are worth more than others. Yeah. Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I guess the way what I understood from what you were saying is, even though you weren't using the words, you're talking about the King of the North, and the King of the North is church over state. But you've just used the words nationalism, which is the same as church, which is the same as religion, but you've used the words nationalism, assuming that we're all on the same page there with our use of our terms. So I think, we've gotten to the stage where we can say nationalism and we don't have to go back and explain, well, this is just another word for church, which means it's another word for woman. This is what Tess showed with the difference between the King of the North and the King of the South. State over church, church over state is in essence patriarchy, and that both are wrong. So when we had, as Adventists, we always thought that the huge sin was church over state when you had a woman in control. But then when she showed that state over church is bad too. So we equate nationalism, church, religion, woman, without having to explain every definition. So I didn't see what you were doing as any leap. It was just using the terms.
Well, I think you've just taken it a step further, that was all. But it's basically the ideology connects culture and nationalism. Is that a
So-
simple way to put it?
Can
So
I-
Elder Terry, when I spoke and asked my question, is it apparent that I've got some sort of mistake in my thinking to you, or that I need to fix? Am I not understanding something, or is it okay?
Yeah, no.
Maybe I
It
didn't
came
understand
across with
nationalism
you
correct?
that John was making some sort of leap, and you wanted him to make the connection. I guess I
Yes,
saw
that's
the
right.
connection. I heard the connection, so he just needs to make that connection clear for you.
Yep.
Can I also just add a little bit to that? I think when we look at all the things that we've come to understand about patriarchy, I'm thinking back to the connection with terrorism, apis bull, survival of the fittest. Who matters in all of that? The one at the top. They're the ones that matter. And I guess especially from a United States perspective, who I think inherently feel superior to a lot of the world already. I know that's not true of everybody, but there does seem to be a culture where they feel they're superior to the rest of the world anyway. Then their nationalism incorporates all of those things, which, you know, their culture, like as has just been said, has to be survival of the fittest, the strongest, whatever. So it's all apis bull type of mentality. So it just all goes together. I think you can't. I don't know that you could have an American nationalism or any sort of maybe real nationalism without that mentality. So therefore, sexism has to be an inaugural part of it, because women have their place, and especially when it starts to bring in atheism and the fact that they see that as just a part of their genetic makeup, that women are for this purpose and men are for that purpose. So anyway, that was just my thoughts on it.
Thanks, Lee.
I might be able to make a link from
I'm
sexism.
closer, Brendan.
I might be able to make a link from sexism straight to nationalism, and I'll just use part of John's study that he told us about, and we've sort of touched on it before. So it's the part where I think I'll even read it. There's a deep fear that if they relinquish the hold they have on women, they might become the oppressed. So that's the underlying belief system. So it is the same fear behind white supremacy. So there's an underlying cultural fear, all right, that drives, there's an underlying sexism. And you could basically go straight to nationalism, or let's call it protectionism, which is a synonym. And so why are they protecting? What are they protecting? Look at the immigrants they're trying to kick out of the country. So that's from a race point of view, but from a gender point of view, they're trying to put all women back to what their original job function is, which is a child bearer and you're a housewife. That's the goal. And so you've got an underlying fear in their culture on both gender and race. And as a result, they have to go into protectionism, which is nationalism. I mean, I've just kept that super simple. Is that fair?
I think I agree with everything you said. Is it, when it comes to the sexism part, it sounds like they've got to protect American culture. I know I'm picking up just on America, but they've got to protect American culture. So is it a breeding thing? Keep the women pumping out American babies? Like, I mean, I know there's more issues with sexism than that, but is that your focus just then in your comment, Brendan? Like I can get the immigrant thing, like that's really clear to me. Like, yeah.
I guess the underlying goal, I guess, from Marga is they've got some vision of what America is supposed to be, and like we talked about in the past, it's paleo conservative. So it's sort of inward looking. They're not looking to force, or they're trying to, and that's a whole nother section, but
Elder Tess originally said racism and sexism is the Sunday law issue. You know, she took us away from Sabbath Sunday to racism and sexism.
so I guess it's not
So they had this vision of the 1950s woman barefoot and pregnant in the house, you know, vacuuming and all that. Is that the ideal? And plus producing American babies and all of that's linked. I can see the link to nationalism with that when I look at it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is similar to what, you know, they're pushing over in, was it Poland? No, Bolsonaro. Was it Bolsonaro? No,
Hungary.
Orban, is it?
Turkey.
Viktor Orban.
Viktor Orban, thank you. Hungary.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like an example of a model that I think that they want, and think about what Viktor Orban's introduced regarding women's roles and tax-free statuses for so many children. It's a political law-based thing they've introduced to strongly encourage women to do what they're supposed to do in their words.
Thank you.
I
And yeah, John, I do see that. Yeah. Sorry, I'll stop talking now. Let others speak.
I don't think they want to take every freedom away from a woman. They just don't want them to be equal.
Yes.
Well, I was just going to say is that I
They can
appreciate
work
that
if they want
nationalism
her.
I think they want to control their freedom, though, right? Because there'd be plenty of nationalistic thinking husbands who wouldn't want their wife to work necessarily, but if they needed the money, then they'd probably want them to work, as well as do all the stuff at home as well. But they get to choose whether or not they think she should or shouldn't work. Not so much her having the freedom to choose in a lot of cases, I think, maybe.
An example of J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, he was talking about the UK. And apparently the UK around abortion clinics have set up a 200-metre no-go zone. But was this one person, he was 50 metres away from the abortion clinic and he was standing there just praying. So he got arrested. So J.D. Vance was more concerned about, like, this is religious freedom under attack. He wasn't at all concerned about the women who went into the clinic. So you can see, like you said, they're trying to control what freedom they have to some degree.
Excuse me, John.
Sorry?
I don't want to change the subject too much because I realise we're on one, line of thought at the moment. So I'll throw this out there. well, but go where you want with it. So you mentioned that Elder Tess was saying that like the Sunday law is not, the Sabbath versus Sunday anymore, and that she said it's racism and sexism. So I'm gathering that you're speaking about 1850 and our time now when she's saying that. But I just wanted to ask, so because I thought that now we're very focused, like the issue what our test is now is sexism and equality. So do you think, this is just a question to put out there, do you think that like there's a lot on racism at the moment? It's not just a little bit, it's a lot. Do you think that there is a combining of 1850 and sexism happening, like the social issue? It's just a question, it's just a thought. So I'm just wondering. Don't even have to answer it.
No, racism's certainly out there now, that's for sure. But again, I think that gets back to the culture, and that ties in with nationalism, because basically America wants a white, male-dominated society.
And we mustn't forget that it's sexism that is at the root of all these problems. It's sexism that is at the root of racism. So a lot of these arguments that are against racism are sometimes protecting cultures that are very sexist on the basis of protecting race. So you haven't really got to the bottom of the problem.
Yeah, what was Elder Tess's? There was two problems. It was we need to see that sexism was the deepest, the darkest, the worst, the most fundamental form of discrimination. And it was the foundation of all other discrimination. I guess we need to see the link from there to racism, which is why we had to sift the left, because they never drew that conclusion. They'd always see the racism.
They didn't see the sexism.
Part of the primary things we have to sift.
She was trying to shift us to the left. There is problems with the left.
And isn't that what Elder Parminder was going through with his studies when he was looking at what is really radical feminism, when he was getting to the fact that feminism, true feminism, actually solves all of those problems? And I think that's speaking to what Elder Terry's just said, and as well, that basically the root cause is, I guess, misogyny, really, isn't it? And sexism. That's the root cause, because it's all about domination. It's all about superiority. It's all about that. So that encompasses everything.
So that in mind then, 1850 was no different. It was just that was sexism, was it the root cause of that too, and misogyny and all that sort of thing. Is that correct?
The root cause. It's always been the root cause. It just wasn't the test. They hadn't got to a stage where the people could be confronted with that. The society at that period of history would never have understood that it's going to take them how many decades to let women to vote. So God's dealing with people where they're at. And in the 1800s, 1700s into the 1800s, it's slavery is what is awakening the consciences of people. Sexism is also starting to awaken. There's always been feminists, but it's been small and growing. So yeah, God takes people where they are.
That just
Thank
also
you.
reminds me of Elder Tess's study about the line of Reformation, basically, and then if you look at what was the first sin, without the first sin, the others wouldn't have been there. So that had to be the core cause of the rest. The rest followed on as almost a natural consequence. So sexism was the initial fall, or that was the result of the fall. So the rest had to be dependent on that.
And even that story of Ham, you see sexism there as in that story, which is also about nationalism.
Yeah.
I have another question to ask him if we have time. I don't know if it's okay.
We'll make this the last question. We haven't got Yambaki, so we will close early. We'll let our Fijian members go and have their lunch. So go ahead, Catherine.
Okay. So it's a slight change of topic. Just interested in people's thoughts, so it can be John or anyone else. Remember that, so I acknowledge, I agree that the King of the South is dead now. But we have had explained to us in the past, the church over state for King of the North and state over church for the King of the South. And now we understand that church is culture, so I completely agree with that. I agree with nationalism being the church. So I agree with all of those things. I just want to have what we think about the King of the South now, because I guess would we flip that upside down and say it was state over culture for the King of the South? And if that's the case, would it be state over nationalism, or like whatever word we want to put in for culture? How would that look now? Because I guess we could see before, like, the state controlled the church, even killed the church. But how does that work when we're talking about culture? It's just a question that's sort of come to my mind as we've been talking today. Do we need to sort of think of it in those terms now when we look at Russia, Soviet Union?
So Putin is still in league with the Orthodox Church. Is that what you're wondering about?
I'm wondering about, I guess what we would say, if we went with the King of the North, we would say it's nationalism over state, Trumpism. What would be the equivalent in Russia if we weren't talking about the Orthodox Church, or do we still need to just keep it at church when we talk about the King of the South? So if we remove church and make a culture in the King of the South, how would that look? Or do we need to do that at all or not? I just don't. I guess you would sort of balance it out. If we're going to do it on one side, we should do it on the other side. And do we need to kind of reinterpret it, or do we just look at the Orthodox Church and go, well, that's the culture embodied in the church?
I think it's broader than that, just like it's broader in the United States, because it's not just Protestantism, it's not just atheism, it's all the isms. You've got all of that in the King of the South as well. It's just they're not all by any means. The church is not doesn't have a hold on the culture of Russia, but their culture, it's the church is a part of it, but it's not all of it.
Okay, so that's good. So the next step would be then, does the state dominate the culture in a different way than we see happening in the King of the North? Is because it should be flipped upside down. So is there some difference?
So MAGA has control of the Republican Party. That's church over state. Putin has control over the culture. That's state over church.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, he controls the nationalism. Does he define? He defines. Everybody has to come into line with his view.
That's his books. That's his history books, his speeches, his rewriting.
Okay, so he can redefine he can define whatever he thinks the Russian culture is, and everybody has to fall into line. Whereas the other way around, the population of coming to
Culture is
control.
defined, yeah, the
Okay.
government.
Okay, thank you.
Did anybody have any questions or comments on that? Any differing thoughts or thoughts to add on that?
That's what I thought as well. I thought it was Putin defining culture or enforcing it. Like he does it through the schools. He does it in all sorts of ways. So if Putin starts a narrative, it spreads across the country and everyone sort of has to fall in line. Whatever the
Even if
cultural
they
issue is.
disagree, they just got to shut up about it.
Yeah, that's what I see. And that's why you've seen an exodus of so many Russians as well.
So much so that's why he's pushing. Yeah, that's the reason for Ukraine. Is he's invented a culture that embraces all the Eastern Bloc. Well, thank you everybody, and thank you, John.